Welcome to the Liberal Democrat History Group. As always, I'm absolutely delighted to be here chairing. I always say this is the first group I joined when I attended my very first federal conference in spring 2016, and so to be asked to chair is a complete honour. The purpose of our meeting today is to talk about the Liberal Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. And as part of this, we have got David Lawes' new book, which he's going to be speaking about. But here we are. There's been lots of talk over this weekend of us having the largest third-party grouping of MPs that has ever been seen in Parliament, and certainly the biggest group of Liberals that we've seen since 1923. But we also have a Labour government with a large, although fragile, majority. So our relationship with Labour historically is something of great interest and the purpose of our meeting today. So given that we are tight for time, I'm going to go straight on to introducing the first of our guests, and that's David Lawes. After being Director of Policy and Research for the Liberal Democrats in 2001, David was elected as the MP for Yeovil. Very pleased to see that is back in Liberal Democrat hands following the recent election. He succeeded Paddy Ashdown in 2004, he co-edited the Orange Book, Reclaiming Liberalism, and in 2010 he was part of the negotiating team for the coalition agreement and then served briefly as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, returning to government as the Minister of State for School Standards and Ministers, assisting the Deputy Prime Minister. After losing his seat in 2015, he ran the Education Policy Institute and is currently chair of its trustees. And he's published several excellent books on coalition. I've read some of them, I agree, and a book on the life and death of Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. And his book, Serpents, Goats and Turkeys, is available to buy at the Liberal Democrat History Group stall and also at the back of the room. David, can I introduce you?
Wendy, thank you very much indeed. I hope that the microphone is working okay with me standing, but do wave if it's not. Wendy, thank you so much for chairing this and for giving already 2 or 3 plugs for the book. A commission is definitely on the way to you. Thanks also to the Lib Dem History Group for arranging this fringe meeting, and to Duncan Brack for having a look at the book when it was at earlier stages, and for removing what could have been a lot of embarrassing errors and mistakes of judgment. He's not, of course, to blame for all of the other conclusions that remain in the book. And thanks also to Jim for being here today because of his experience in particular, not just in Westminster but in Scotland. I think he's going to add a fascinating amount to the debate. I realised coming here today that this is 30 years now since my first ever Lib Dem conference in Brighton in 1994, when dear Liz Truss was making her speech abolition to monarchy. It's also, as Wendy was kind enough to mention, 20 years since my previous attempt to have a book launch at a party conference in 2004 with the Orange Book, which didn't quite happen given the difference of view between myself and the party leader on whether it would be useful to hold the event. So I'm particularly relieved that it's happened today, though I did point out to Charles and others that book sold a tremendous number of copies, which was a source of great pride to me, until the then Chief Executive of the party, Chris Renard, told me that he was buying up every available copy, storing them in his garage, and was going to have an enormous bonfire at the end of the process. I think he was joking, but I'm not too sure. Anyway, the book that I've written, I found fascinating because the history of this period of time, 1903 right through to 2019, is fascinating. And actually, I discovered there were quite a lot of bits that I knew precious little about, and I really ought to have known quite a lot about. That may not be the case with many of you in the room, with your roots in the Lib Dem History Group, and with your extensive experience. I glance around the room and spot various people who will have particular things to say about various chapters. But it's a fascinating history, which I suspect some of you won't know everything about all phases. And also it's particularly timely because it was fairly obvious when I started writing this book that we were going to end up with some kind of Labour government. And reflecting on what the lessons have been of that long, long period of time, I think is worth doing at this point in time. I'll start by going straight to answer the question that's posed by the title of this, which is Liberals and Labour, Friends or Enemies, Allies or Competitors. Because the answer to that very clearly, having gone through this book and written all the various chapters, is that the two parties have at times been friends and allies, and at other times bitter enemies and competitors. And I've divided the period from 1903 to 2019 down into 8 sort of sub-periods, in which the relationships and dynamics between the two parties have been very different. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those sub-periods today, and then talk a little bit about the lessons in the time that we've got. I'm not, it will relieve you to know, going to go through all 8 sub-periods, otherwise we'll be here until 4 or 5 o'clock this evening. But I thought I'd pick out 4 sort of periods in particular. The early phase up until 1914, which is a phase of the two parties being allies, largely. Then there's a long period of time with different sort of sub-phases between the First World War right up to the period of the Alliance, where the parties were largely competitors, but with different relationships at different periods of time. Then, of course, there was the furious competition during the Alliance days to shove each other out of the way in order to establish, in our case, the Alliance as the second party of British politics. And then after that did not succeed from our perspective. There was the sort of progressive renaissance that there was between Paddy Ashdown and Blair between the sort of early 1990s and 1999. So I want to very briefly discuss those periods and then look at the lessons from the whole period of time. I suppose the period of time that I was most ignorant about was the really early stage of the evolution in relationships between the two parties, which is fascinating. The birth of the first Lib-Lab MPs in the 1870s, which would have been a wonderful way for the two parties to work together and for us to maintain our dominance, because essentially we had working class trade union MPs who took the Liberal whip. That would have been a fantastic way to evolve the relationship, but unfortunately, towards the end of that century, probably the lack of advanced social policy in the Liberal Party, combined with the more radical impulses of many trade unionists and emerging Labour Party members, meant that there was a separate Labour Party that established itself with the first independent Labour Party MPs in 1892 and the Labour Representation Committee being set up in 1900. But by the turn of the century, both parties were actually really struggling against their unionist opponents. The Labour Party only had 2 members of Parliament, or were really finding it difficult to break through as a fringe party from the outside of British politics. And rather unknown, I think, to many people who assume that 1906 was just a sort of reassertion of Liberal strength in a two-party system, the Liberal Party had been through a terrible period of 20 years in the run-up to 1906, where they lost most of the elections, the Unionists were dominant in British politics, and I was surprised to know that even in 1900, our party, the Liberal Party, only stood 402 candidates for the 670 seats, which is astonishing from this perspective in a two-party system. So what that meant was that in 1903, the Liberal Party did something very odd, looked at from a historical perspective, but which might have seemed rational at the time. They did a deal with Ramsay MacDonald to stand down and give Labour an unopposed run in around 30 seats. And in 1906, the Labour Party fielded about 50 candidates. Most of the ones that stood in 3 party seats, where all 3 parties were fighting, lost, but 29 Labour MPs were elected, up from that 2 number in 1900, and most of them were elected where the Liberals decided not to stand. Now, you might have thought that instantly looked a very serious misjudgment to the Liberal Party, and there were some who asserted that it was a major blunder. Indeed, part of the title of this book, Serpents, refers to a senior Liberal in the North who warned that the pact was nursing into life a serpent that would sting the Liberal Party to death by giving this opportunity for the Labour Party to establish itself in Parliament and set up its own Labour group in 1906. And by the way, very rapidly to fold the Lib Lab MPs into that Labour group afterwards to push the total number of Labour MPs above 50. But in the context of 1906, the Liberal leadership actually thought that they'd done a phenomenal, brilliant job. They had made sure that many Labour candidates didn't stand against Liberals in seats that were quite marginal. Some of the Labour people had broken through in working class seats that the Liberals hadn't previously been strong in. And essentially 1906 ended up being a phenomenal pincer movement against the Unionists, who went down from 402 MPs at the previous election to 156. And I think in the context of 2024, a lot of us assume, gosh, that landslide election must mean the Unionists did terribly, their vote share was appalling, equivalent maybe to the Rishi Sunak vote share recently. But that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the Unionist Party had over 43% of the vote in that election. They were only a few percentage points behind the Liberals. But the pincer movement from the Liberals and Labour fighting in different seats and avoiding competition against each other meant that the Unionists did extremely badly. And of course, in those days, there was a fair degree of policy alignment between the parties. There was, as there's been ever since, a left wing of the Labour Party that was much more socialist inclined and a much more pragmatic right of the party. But on the big issues of the day, on free trade, on home rule, on progressive taxation, on pensions, on internationalist versus insular, the two parties were pretty aligned. And of course, as the Liberals then went into government, the Labour members of Parliament generally ended up supporting Liberal positions, and they were contained fairly well in the two general elections in 1910, at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, over the budget and over House of Lords. So that by 1914, Labour were only on 36 seats, including the Lib Lab members that had been folded in. They'd lost most of the by-elections in the run-up to 1914, and although they were doing quite well at a local government election level, all of the discussion at Westminster was about pacts and deals and alliances and coalitions and further seat deals whenever the next general election was going to be. And it won't surprise you to know that Lloyd George was a major part of all those sorts of conspiracies, putting himself, as ever, at the middle of the political system. So up until 1914, the party had done this very odd thing in letting Labour in, but it had been successful in the short term, and the two parties were working relatively well together, although they were obviously, to some extent, competitors as well as allies. All of that ended when the First World War broke out. And it ended for two reasons, really. Firstly, from our perspective, because we had that devastating split in the leadership of the party, where the formidable team of Asquith and Lloyd George, who were the two Liberals who really had the capability of evolving the Liberal Party from its 19th century form to where it needed to be in the 20th century, they broke up when Lloyd George stabbed Asquith in the back, and the Liberal Party never really recovered from that internal fight. That gave the Labour Party the opportunity to clarify that its strategy now was to push the Liberal Party aside rather than to work with it against the Unionists. And up until then, there had been some controversy within the Labour Party about that. People like Ramsay MacDonald were very pragmatic. He didn't want lots of Labour candidates. He didn't want Labour thinking that they could break straight through against the Liberals. He thought that the Unionists might benefit from that. But in this period, the Liberal division was so obvious that Labour had to take its opportunity. And of course, something else really important happened over the period of the First World War, which is the state got much, much bigger and assumed much more responsibility in the economy. Russia had its revolution and moved to the Soviet Union, indicating perhaps to some people that socialism was the future of the economic system. And suddenly the debate in economic policy was not free trade versus tariffs, which had put Liberals and Labour on the same side against the Unionists, who were at times the pro-tariff party, but it became capitalism versus socialism. And Labour, of course, had the Clause 4, insertion in the new Labour Party constitution in 1918 with a commitment to nationalise the means of production and distribution and exchange. So at that stage, the policy and philosophical position of the parties moved apart. The tactics of the two parties moved apart to be much more competitors, and they ushered in a long period of fairly overt competition, arguably from the First World War right through to the even more intense competition after 1979. But there were sub-phases within that. In 23-24 and 29-31, as most of you will know, the Liberals worked to effectively allow minority Labour government to operate and almost got the alternative vote off Ramsay MacDonald in 1930-31 when they then ran out of time and the government collapsed. And Ramsay MacDonald at that time was determined that a Labour government was going to show itself to be responsible, cautious, moderate economically. After Philip Snowden's first budget, the King wrote him a complimentary letter congratulating him on the enormous budget surplus, and one of Philip Snowden's colleagues described him as about as radical as a member of the Junior Carlton Club. So the economic strategy of the Labour Party then was actually probably in some ways to the right of Lloyd George and the Liberal Party. But all of that moderation changed in 1931 when Labour itself split up and the Ramsay MacDonald Snowden lot went one way and most of the Labour Party went the other. And beyond that, Labour became much more a party of nationalisation, much more a party of socialism. And I was surprised to the extent, there's another thing I didn't know and have to confess to, I was surprised to the extent to which the Liberal Party between 31 and 56 was essentially on a Conservative-inspired life support machine, where the vast majority of our MPs were elected without unionist, now Conservative competition, and where we had seat pacts in various parts of the country, like Huddersfield and Bolton, where Liberals and Conservatives got together to stand down in favour of each other in different parts of those areas. And when Grimond became party leader in 56, he was the only one of the 6 MPs who then survived who was elected with in a three-party competition. Most had no Conservative opposition. By the 1970s, and I won't go into all the Lib Lab Pact and stuff, we can pick stuff up in Q&A about the sub-periods, and we've got people like Tom here who know far more about it. But by the 1970s, although Labour had a number of leaders who were trying to present a more moderate face, the activist part of the Labour Party was moving quite strongly to the left. And looking back at the 1970 Labour manifesto, before even the longest suicide note manifesto of Foot, famously in 1983, the 1970 Labour manifesto was surprisingly left-wing and radical. It was pretty anti-European. It was pro-mass nationalisation of more or less everything that wasn't bolted down. It was in favour of price controls, an industrial relations policy which was heavily trade union skewed. It was in favour of phasing out NATO and very, very anti-private school. So during that period of time, Labour was a beast that was much more difficult to imagine a Liberal Party working effectively with, notwithstanding the Lib Lab Pact, which we had between 77 and 78. I can speed through the next couple of phases when you will be pleased to know more quickly, because they're simpler and probably more known to most of us in the room. After the Lib Lab Pact collapsed and after the election of 79, the Labour Party did move off decisively to the left. Many of the more moderate, I was going to say better people, but I better be careful, many of the more moderate and some great people moved to establish the SDP, and then we had a period of time where the SDP Liberal Alliance competed against the Labour Party and came very close in 1983 to moving above Labour in terms of vote share, but actually suffered both because of the Falklands War, which caused Conservative support to rally, and the nature of the first-past-the-post political system that meant that we had a very similar vote share as Labour in 1983, but Labour had, I think, 200 or more MPs, and the Alliance had mid-20s. So first-past-the-post essentially stopped that process, and by the late 80s, it was clear that the Lib Dems, as we were becoming, were not going to be able to replace Labour. So we had quite a long period of competition of different forms after the First World War broke out. And then we went back in the early 1990s to a much more cooperative, sort of progressive consensus and an attempt to work across parties. That was partly because the Conservatives had won so many elections in a row that Labour were desperate to look at any way that they could defeat the Conservatives. And it was partly that with the success of Blair becoming leader of the Labour Party in 1994, he reached out to Paddy Ashdown. They were both very similarly thinking in terms of many of their views about policy, and they worked very closely together outside government initially, pre-97, and then for a period inside government, delivering various constitutional changes. Ultimately, they did not succeed in doing what they both wanted to do and bringing the two parties together more permanently. And one of the reasons for that was the momentous Labour majority in 97 and afterwards that meant that Labour needed the Lib Dems less. But it was also that they had a fundamentally different approach to where they wanted to end up in. Blair couldn't really understand why many people in the Lib Dems and Labour were not in the same party. He thought the parties were parties of similar values and policies, and it was crazy for people to be in separate parties. So his end destination was the two parties merging. That was not Paddy's end destination. Paddy's end destination was a pluralist system enabled by voting reform. And ironically, while many of us were worried in 97 to 99 that Paddy might be too pragmatic and too desperate to do all the lib-lab stuff and too willing to concede something on electoral reform that would be too modest, it ended up being the case that, partly because Tony Blair encouraged him to think for a while that Labour might deliver AV plus a top-up, which was never really likely, it ended up that Paddy probably pushed for something that was never deliverable within the context of 97 to 99, and it's one of those interesting questions of history, whether actually the party should have been much more pragmatic and should have settled for something more modest. So what are the historic lessons from this long period, which I've concertinaed probably quite inelegantly into the short time we've got? Well, I think some of the conclusions are these. Firstly, the parties started off in the 1900s with quite a lot in common in terms of policies and values. But after 1918, the dividing line, particularly between socialism and capitalism, between big state and smaller state, did become quite a deep ditch between the two parties and remained so arguably up until much more recent times. Since 1903, somewhat contrary to the view of some people that the Liberal Democrats and Labour Party are natural allies, we've actually been in government for 19 years with the Conservatives over that period of time and only 9 with Labour, and that's if you include the Lib-Lab Pact in those 9 years. Only if we add in 97 to 99, Paddy and Blair, and the minority Labour administrations in the 20s, and arguably 1906 to 1915, when Labour MPs for some time sat on the same side of the House of Commons as the Liberal MPs after 1910, then you end up with 19 Lib-Con years and 23 Lib-Lab years. So there's a much more balanced relationship there than you might think. And only in 2 of those periods, which I've mentioned, 2 of the 8, have the relationship between the Labour Party and the Liberal Party and Lib Dems been really close and constructive and ally-like. And those are 1903 to 1914 and 92 to 99. And I think we can say that between 29 and 31, the two parties were working quite closely together, but not that they liked each other. Indeed, Ramsay MacDonald couldn't stand Lloyd George, but because they had to, really. We were trying to get AV, Labour was trying to stay in power. So we've also had periods of intense competition, and 79 to 92 and 31 to 56 have been the most obvious of those. From all of this experience, I've tried to figure out what the drivers are of distance and proximity to Labour, and concluded that there are probably 5, and put this at the back of the book where I've described how those 5 sort of perform in each of those 8 phases. And they are very obviously policy alignment. They are the enthusiasm, particularly of the larger party, to work with the smaller party. They are the size and clout of the smaller party, because when it becomes too small, nobody really wants to deal with it. There's the attitude of the larger party to electoral reform, and then the size of the governing majority, because when governments have very large majorities, they tend to be less bothered about relationships with other parties. The other conclusion, and I'm coming to the last 2 because Wendy will be getting nervous, the other conclusion is that periods of Labour government haven't necessarily automatically been periods after which the Liberal Democrats and Liberals have done badly. There are plenty of periods where Labour have been in power and we've done very well after Labour has left power. What's really been damaging for our party over time has not been Labour being in power, but our proximity to power, either by being in a coalition, by being in a minority government position, by being in a Lib-Lab pact, by even being in that situation where the governing party has a tiny majority in the way Lib Dems are voting in Parliament, matters tremendously, and the electorate eventually decide they want to change in government, and the Liberals get swept out with the governing party. So in 24, 31, 51, 66, October 74, 1979, 2015, we've paid an immense price for being anywhere near national government in the United Kingdom. And the final thought is this, that electoral reform has clearly been a key potential enabler of party cooperation right from the beginning. Pre-1914, it was the Labour Party that were really interested in electoral reform and trying to interest the Liberal Party in it. And then as the Liberal Party became less influential and powerful, we suddenly got a much enhanced interest in electoral reform. And the consistency of the party's views about electoral reform over that period is quite marked, I think. Ours towards, single transferable vote, pure PR, Labour parties towards some sort of preference system, although Labour have always been a bit split, and the Conservative Party opposed to any type of electoral reform. And what marks our attempts at Westminster to achieve electoral reform is that all of the attempts have generally been relatively rushed, often quite sort of opportunistic, and without being planned over a period of time that would arguably allow them to be successfully delivered. And I think that's a lesson for all parties, that the time to think about these long-term constitutional changes is when you have the position in government to do that, not, as Gordon Brown attempted in 2009, right at the end of the Parliament, where it's too late to effect any change. The one exception to all of that, the devastating effect that coalitions have done on our party nationally, and our failure to think long-term about electoral reform. The one exception to that is in a part of the United Kingdom called Scotland, and that's why our next speaker is Jim Wallace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I was at an electoral reform fringe last night, and I think our general agreement there was rather than trying to persuade parliamentarians who are not supportive of PR to decide to support PR, we just needed to elect more Liberal Democrats. That was our view. But thank you very much for that. That was fascinating. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker. David has already referenced him. Jim Wallace is the key figure in our relationship with Labour at the start of the Scottish Parliament. Jim was the MP for Orkney and Shetland from 1983 to 2001, and then MSP for Orkney from 1999 to 2007, and he was the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats from 1992 to 2005. And in that capacity, he was responsible for negotiating the coalition agreement with Labour after the first Scottish Parliament election in 1999, and became Deputy First Minister and Minister for Justice. And after the coalition was renewed, after the second Scottish Parliament election in 2003, Jim served as Deputy First Minister and Minister for Enterprise and Lifelong Learning. In 2007, he entered the Lords as Lord Wallace of Tankerness, and during coalition served as the Advocate General for Scotland. And most recently, he was moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland from 2021 to 2022. Really interested to hear your experiences of actually being friends or enemies, allies or competitors. Jim.
Thank you very much. Is this microphone working okay? Yes. Good. And thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you, David. It was when David was talking about Lloyd George, I thought I sensed a slight bristle to my right here. And then, of course, it dawned on me that Wendy is, of course, the successor in North East Fife to Asquith. And that got me thinking, because Wendy is not only a successor to that Liberal leader, but also to Ming Campbell, Lib Dem leader. David was successor to Paddy Ashdown, and I was successor to Joe Grimmond. I'm not quite sure what that says, but, but if there's anyone in the audience who also holds a seat, which was the previous seat of a Liberal leader, just watch out, you might be up here next time round. But thanks, David, thanks for this book. I think it is fascinating, your address. David sent an email with a sort of a copy during the week, and I will confess I have read the bit from about, I think, 1999 up to the present day. But what you've said, David, I really much look forward to reading bits of history I never knew, and even the bits from 1992 to 2019 filled in gaps that I wasn't always quite aware of what had been going on. I suppose my first engagement in terms of Lib-Labery was I had just been selected as a prospective candidate in Dumfriesshire in 1976, when the following year David Steele embarked on the Lib-Lab Pact. Now, the one thing I always remember David was saying afterwards was that responsibility without power is not actually something you want to seek, and I always kept that at the back of my mind in subsequent negotiations. But also David, at one point in his book, wonders, he's got the 5 guidance of traffic lights, almost, he said, which I'll come back to. But he also wonders whether the relationship between the respective leaders was important too. And Tom McNally will know more about this than anyone else here, but he suggests that whilst Callaghan and Steele didn't necessarily start out very well, it was a relationship that built up. And it brought back, reading that, it brought back a memories for me of being at a glee club at Liberal Party assemblies in these days. So there might be some people here who live. And there was a song we used to sing. It was back in 1977. We went to, back in 1977, David went to Uncle Jim. He didn't ask for much, he got much less. I got on well with him. To the tune of the Happy Wanderer. But I do say, I think it was I think, instructive. I still think there was things in that period which actually were good and were delivered. And also, let's not kid ourselves, it actually gave David Steele a profile. He was already reasonably well known, but it gave him a profile which we went into the 79 election, we did certainly better than we were doing in by-elections when we were losing and coming behind the National Front in 1976 and 77. And David Alton's victory in Edge Hill, basically on the day after the election was called, undoubtedly gave us a boost and gave us a credibility. But if I can fast forward to 1989, when the 79 referendum did not go well because there was a referendum, and then there was a barrier put in that we had to get 40% of the total electorate supporting the establishment of the Scottish Assembly, and that's what stymied it. And the whole thing, didn't really. Mrs. Thatcher had come to power. There wasn't that much going on. How were we going to actually get this movement again, momentum for a Scottish Parliament? And in 1988, in the autumn, Jim Sillars won the Gavin by-election, and the Labour Party were a bit spooked, to put it mildly. They then saw a need to have a better coming together of people who wanted a Scottish Parliament. And around about the same time, there was a claim of right which had been put together by a number of luminaries, and it set out some principles for having a Scottish Parliament. And Labour went along with this and agreed that we would have a constitutional convention to put flesh on the bones and try and establish how a Scottish Parliament might work. Now, I remember sitting in a committee room in the House of Commons when, with members of the Labour Party, to discuss how we would take this forward. We were expecting someone to come from the SNP, and Margaret Ewing did come and said that they weren't interested. They wouldn't take part. So basically, as we went into the Constitutional Convention, there was the Liberal Democrats, there was the Labour Party, there was the Scottish Communist Party, there were the Greens, there was civic government, local government, churches, the STUC, a number of organisations, islands movements, all trying to put together a plan, a framework for a Scottish Parliament. And we got, the first framework was produced in 1991, and during that period, Malcolm Bruce, who was then leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, managed to negotiate with Labour in principle to get the principle of proportional representation accepted. But when we went to the election in 1992, there was no flesh on that particular bone. There was nothing there about any fiscal powers. And the 1992 election produces the one result that none of us foresaw. We'd all been speculating what would happen if there was a Tory wipeout in Scotland, what would happen even if it was just the status quo. None of us ever predicted that there would be more Conservative MPs in Scotland after the 1992 election than there were going into the 1992 election. So that knocked back for a while the Constitutional Convention. But then we decided, well, yeah, we better, get over this and get on with it. And we knew that one of the key things was to get a system of proportional representation. And a small group was established, not really a subgroup of the convention, but nominated by the convention. The Liberal Democrats were represented by John Laurie, who was a former convener of the party and former treasurer of the party. And he did argue valiantly for STV, but at the end of the day, what was produced by this organisation, by this group, was a form of the additional member system. We would have the first past the post seats, and in what were effectively the European constituencies, most of them, there would be 7 top-up members to get proportionality across that Euro constituency in terms of a second vote. We were never really allowed to call it a second vote, but in terms of the other vote. And we agreed to that. It wasn't the best. We wanted STV, but we thought this would work. Perhaps just a footnote that it is often said when the SNP got their majority on that system in 1911, people sort of pointed the finger at the Labour Party and said, well, here's the system you wanted to stop the SNP ever getting an outright majority. And I said, I never, in any of the debates or discussions we had, ever heard anyone in the Labour Party say that their agreement of it was to stop the SNP getting overall majority. I was never under any illusion or whatever. I always said it was to stop the Labour Party getting an overall majority. So it was actually a progression that we agreed the STV, we agreed the EMS system, and George Robertson and I had a battle, a discussion as to whether there should be 113 seats or 145. We actually managed to get an extra seat in first past the post by splitting Orkney and Shetland, which I reckon would give us an extra seat, and the Labour Party bought it. And so George and I decided to half it down the middle, 129, which is what it is today. And I got hell from some of our activists, and George Robertson got hell from some of the Labour activists, so we agreed that we probably got it right. And that's how we got the electoral system that we have. But I think if we look at how we managed to get agreement with the Labour Party in a coalition, the convention was important. The fact that the SNP had no part in it, and the Conservative Party were never going to have any part in it, meant that the two biggest parties in there were the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. And the Labour Party were reliant on us to give the convention credibility. Because if we'd walked away from it, it would have been a Labour Party, albeit there were some others there, but it would have been seen as a Labour Party thing, and would not have motivated people in the same way. But the fact that they needed us, and we obviously wanted the goal. We wanted the goal of the Scottish Parliament, and that I think was what motivated us and fueled us to try and get an agreement. And there were many, many lengthy meetings, and we eventually did actually produce an agreement launched on St Andrew's Day, 1995. And on that basis, we then, both parties put it in our manifesto, and on that basis we were elected in 1997, when there was actually a Conservative wipeout in Scotland and no Conservative MPs. The SNP came on board for the referendum campaign. I'll say something about that in a minute. And then, having got the yes vote in the referendum campaign, we then went our separate ways campaigning in the election. Now, the referendum was, let's say it was tricky, because we had loads of negotiations in the Constitutional Convention as to how you entrench the Scottish Parliament. We knew that legally, given the Westminster Parliament's so-called sovereignty, that there was no way we could put in a clause saying this Parliament will last forever, because Westminster could pass a law which just did away with that. And we've tried various things, and we actually explicitly rejected the idea of a referendum. So when the Labour Party announced, with no warning, that we're having a referendum, I can tell you, Liberal Democrats in Scotland were not at all happy. And neither were some members of the Labour Party. Paddy had been forewarned about it and had the good sense to alert me the night before the announcement was due to be made. And as I went into Westminster the following morning, I met the Labour Party's front bench spokesman on constitutional affairs, John McCallion. And I said, "What are you guys playing at with the referendum?" And he said to me, "What referendum?" And I had to tell the Labour Party's shadow spokesman on constitutional what the policy now was. And it was the two questions, one on the principle of the convention scheme, and secondly on whether the Parliament should have tax-varying powers. In retrospect, I think we were wrong. I think the fact that the referendum carried quite significantly on both questions meant that the Parliament had a political entrenchment, which we were never going to get with a legal entrenchment. And subsequently, the Smith Commission, there have been other amendments to the Scotland Act, but it's not quite the same as a political entrenchment. And it's now very clear that you could not really disband the Scottish Parliament without another referendum. So I think that entrenchment has worked. But it did cause a bit of friction between ourselves and the Labour Party as we approached the 1997 election. But then we came together to campaign in that referendum, along with the SNP, who did take part in it. And as I say, we got some substantial results. And then the election in 1999, I said, was one of the most liberating elections I had ever fought. Because so often, even from the way back in 1979, 1983, there was always a constitutional issue hanging over us. But in 1999, we had a parliament with powers, quite substantial powers, and we were able to debate education and health and transport and local government. That was good, solid things that we could debate about. Now, subsequently, of course, the whole thing's been hijacked again by the constitutional issue, and we don't spend as much time as I believe we ought to on the other issues that actually matter to people in their everyday lives. But when we came after the election, it was as expected. The Labour Party didn't get a majority; they were well short of a majority, and we made the difference. David, when he goes on his traffic lights, goes and lists them, and I think you say, David, that the alignment we had in Scotland was on every part of that. Policy alignment. Well, we were pretty aligned on policy. The two manifestos did overlap, and David will remember this because he came up and gave us substantial help and assistance in negotiating the partnership agreement. And it was submitted to a small group of people who would go through the two manifestos, work out where there was agreement, and then remit back to the plenary session of the negotiators with things in brackets as to where we couldn't agree and we had to negotiate it. And I always remember Donald Dewar looking at this with a bit thing in brackets, and he read it out and said, "So what kind of liberal nonsense is this?" And I said, "It's from the Labour manifesto, Donald." He had the good grace to laugh. So there was quite a considerable amount of... we had key difficult issues like tuition fees, beef on the bone, I seem to remember, tolls on the Skye Bridge. But we did actually have a considerable alignment. So willingness of the larger party. Now there clearly was willingness in the Labour Party to have a coalition. They didn't have a majority. They wanted a coalition. And that was certainly to our advantage. then the size of the smaller party, well, we were not insignificant. We had enough to quite clearly put us over the line into a working majority. Electoral reform had already been sorted out, and it says majority size. Yes, majority size. It did give us the majority. I was always of a mind in these negotiations, if we didn't get it, I said we would be constructive, we would be reasonable. We'd always said we would initially negotiate with the party with the largest number of seats, but I was willing to walk away if we didn't get what we wanted. On 2 occasions I remember just folding up a folder, said, Donald, we've tried our best. Sorry, I don't think this is going to work, but we will be reasonable and responsible in opposition. And that concentrated the mind. So you say, how much did the Labour Party want? It certainly concentrated the mind. There was one afternoon when we were getting pretty desperate and difficult. I got a message to say that the Prime Minister would like to speak to you on the phone. So I took the phone call from Tony Blair and told him that tuition fees were a sticking point, and he tried to reason with me, and he even says in his memoirs that he didn't make any progress. And then about half an hour later, we were in what was the old Midlothian County Council buildings, and the walls were quite thin. And in the room next door was Donald Dewar, and I heard him having a conversation, and the person who was having the conversation voice was so loud that I knew it was Paddy Ashdown. And later, when Donald and I went back together to see if we could do it, and Donald said, well, you really ought to know that I've spoken to your party leader this afternoon. And I said, I've spoken to yours. And we, through just determination, but recognising that none of us were going to concede on anything of fundamental importance to us, we actually got there, and we got an agreement. And it was one which, significantly, though none of us could have thought that at the time, it was firstly when Donald died, and then when Henry McLeish resigned, we actually had a framework agreement, a pretty detailed agreement, which around the two parties could coalesce. And as long as the incoming First Minister from the Labour Party was prepared to say, I agree with this, we were prepared to vote for the First Minister's election in the Scottish Parliament. As I say, in 2003, we did it again. We took more time to get the agreement because we thought there was no reason why we should be done within the first 3 or 4 days. And amongst that, we actually got an agreement on the single transferable vote for local government. And I'll spare Wendy's blushes when I say, when I went and did a tour of Scotland visiting constituencies in the summer after that, I went to meet the Liberal Democrat group on Fife Council and said, you're not serious about this PR stuff, are you? And I said, oh yes I am. And but it was, and again we paved the way to that because we had got the agreement in principle that we would look at it, and the coalition in 1999 did set up a working group to look at possible systems, and SCV came forward as the one which was well suited to it. So we had actually got that as well. So that was my experience, and I think it is that there was an expectation that the Labour Party certainly needed us in the convention. We had a common goal, and when the numbers came out, they were such that what we did was what everyone expected, but also it made good sense, and we weren't asked to give up anything as a great matter of principle, and the Labour Party were content to go along with the proposals. And that's how we got where we did. And I think the fact that in 2003, our share of the regional list vote went up, and again in 2007 it went up, but by that stage the Labour Party vote had come down sufficiently that we could no longer form arithmetically a majority, and the SNP embarked on a minority government. And as I say, well, the rest is history, but I'm not quite sure the rest is the future as well.
Thanks everybody. We're clearly going to have a very limited time for Q&A, but I'd just like to bring Duncan in just with the Lib Dem History Group, so give us a sec.
Quickly, to tell you a little bit about the Lib Dem History Group. We exist to promote the research and discussion of historical topics about the party and its predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SPP, and we do this in 3 main ways: through organising meetings like this, I can tell you we'll have another meeting. Our next meeting will be in London in the National Liberal Club, January and February, and then have a fringe at the Spring Conference at Harrogate. We hope the fringe will be our normal post-election analysis, the Lib Dem performance in the 2024 election. I expect it to be a little bit happier than our previous ones in 2013, 2017 and 2015. We publish a range of publications. This is our latest one, Liberal History, a concise history of the Liberal Party, STP and Lib Dems. Everything you wanted to know about political history, political liberalism of Britain, completely updated for 2024. And of course our flagship publication is the Journal of Liberal History, a quarterly. This is the latest one. You can subscribe to our exhibition stand, either digital or print versions. If you subscribe, you also get a 20% discount off everything we sell, our own range of books and booklets, and also other people's books, including David's. So normal price is £25. If you subscribe, £20. There's a special offer just for you good people for being here in the meeting. You can buy a copy now for £20 at the back of the hall. So come and talk to us in the exhibition. If you'd like to offer any help with running the group, we'd really like to hear from you. But come and talk to us in the exhibition. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Because I've not gone back to Scotland this week, I've not had the opportunity to catch up on my journal. I was looking forward to reading John Curtis's analysis because the last few have been fairly disappointing, but certainly the front cover looks better. Look, I'm going to try really hard to let's try and get 2 rounds of 3 questions in. Flora, Devon and gentleman there with the glasses towards the back, and then we'll try and come round again if I can ask people to keep the questions short.
I'm going to be a bit naughty, but the period does cover 2019, and we haven't touched on the negotiations with Labour in 2010, which I was always very disappointed that we didn't succeed to do that. If I'm allowed to ask that question.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Flora. Next.
Thank you. Just a quick question for David and Jim. Jim, I think, is the only person who's had the honour of serving in not one but 2 coalition governments, one in Scotland and one in Westminster. And David, clearly you were part of the Westminster coalition in 2010. Dare we even think about a coalition in 2029? Because I heard the first reference in the hall yesterday to the 2029 election, which terrified me. And given the car crash that the 2010-2015 coalition with the Conservatives was, dare we even think about another coalition, albeit the Labour Party?
Right, thank you. And just at the back there, and short questions, please, so I can try and get another round in.
David, in your analysis, you mentioned that the 5th element which helps facilitate cooperation is the size of the larger party. Considering when at Westminster and in first class post this cooperation, it leads to massive majorities for the larger party, are we stuck in a cycle where we will always end up always the bridesmaid and never the bride?
Great, thank you very much. So 2010, 2029, and are we stuck in a cycle? David, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, there's a lovely quote from David Steele at the time of 2010, I think, where he described the coalition we did then as an unfortunate but necessary coalition with the wrong party, which is not a criticism of Nick Clegg, I think, or the negotiating team or the decision the party made at the time, simply that there was no other credible alternative, and the votes were simply not there to do a Labour coalition. So although that's where all of the sort of value alignment in the parties have been over a long period of time, it wasn't possible in 2010. And if I can give the Journal of Lib Dem History a plug for their brilliant work, they also had a fantastic article post-2015 in which Phil Cowley described 2010 as a zugzwang situation. A zugzwang is something I'd never heard of, but it's a situation in chess, apparently, where it's your go, and any potential move you make is going to make your situation worse. And I think that's pretty much where we were in 2010. We had very limited opportunities. On 2029 and whether there should be coalitions and coalition talk, I mean, I would encourage Ed to do what I suspect he is going to do, which is not talk about coalitions, deals, pacts and everything. They have tended to have quite a toxic impact on in the past, and diluting a party identity is a very dangerous thing to do. But the lesson, I think, of previous periods, and this clicks into the very last question about large majorities and parties not being interested in making constitutional change when they are in a strong position. The lesson of the past, from both a Labour perspective and a Lib Dem perspective, is if you take that view and leave everything to the last moment, then it's very difficult to evolve the constitution and electoral system in a sensible way. So I would say that this is a good time for both the Lib Dem party and the Labour Party to be thinking about the right constitutional reforms for the UK's future, precisely when the Labour Party has got a big majority, when the distance between Lib Dems and Labour is fairly significant. Leaving it to the last moment is not a sensible thing to do. So I think the parties should remain apart, not talk about coalition, but they should think about long-term constitutional change in the way that Jim and Malcolm and others did in Scotland, which was a long process, but delivered at the end of that process.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, well, David probably knows more about the detailed face-to-face negotiations in 2010. I was sort of in the back room, and I do remember after you had a meeting with the Labour Party, their negotiating team, and let's be honest about it, I think people emotionally would have been happier if that had been the case. But I just remember our negotiating team coming back from that meeting with their shoulders down and saying there was no way we could get an agreement. A, it wasn't arithmetically possible, but B, they were trying to negotiate with people who some of them really weren't interested. Is that a fair comment, David? Yeah. And you were there. And so I think it was and the zwang, or whatever it is actually quite a good description of it. In 2029, I would echo what David said. We shouldn't be talking about coalitions. We should be setting out our stall. And at the end of the day, it's the arithmetic. The arithmetic will either lead to a coalition or a possibility of a coalition, or it won't. And the question, will we ever get one with a big majority? All I would say is that having agreed a PR system for the Scottish Parliament, the Labour Party, to its huge credit, actually legislated for it. And they had a big enough majority. They didn't need to. But they legislated for it. They brought it forward in their white paper. And I think there's not many examples in history where a party actually has given away power through legislation. And I think it is to the Labour Party's credit that they did that in 1997.
We are at time. I'm going to do one more quick round. So hands, gentleman there in the white, gentleman there with the glasses, and gentleman up the back there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
I think there might be a sixth factor, which is whether the culture of the larger party includes the view that the smaller party should exist at all. And if there's one constant in Labour's, I would be interested in what David found out about this, but there's one constant in Labour's culture about us, from the post-First World War time to now, is the view of many members of the Labour Party that we shouldn't exist at all, and that the only explanation for our existence is that we are Tories and elders and splinter pro-capitalist party, and there's no other explanation for why we.
Great, thank you. If I can have the other two questions, but very short, please, and I'll ask the panellists to give very short answers. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. A question for David Laws, really. Do you think that, had it not been for the First World War, there would have been anything inevitable about the Labour Party replacing the Liberal Party? Because it's striking that even if you look at sort of what was being written in 1914, it was still very much seen as being part of a bigger Liberal coalition and not semi-independent, but not really separate from the Liberal Party, even then. And there was still some working class people backing the Liberals rather than Labour.
Lovely. Thank you. And the third question, nice and short, please.
The numbers become a lot easier if you start second. Given our aim is to beat the job in the blue wall, what are the lessons from everything you have been talking about to get us into that second place?
Jim, if I can bring you in first, just if there's any comments you want to make. I know a couple of the questions were directed at David.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is part of the thing that the party's actually got to address. Actually, how do we actually go forward from here? There's not many seats where we're second to Labour, and therefore, the natural thing to do would be to look at how we can actually carry on where we've actually closer. One caveat I would say to that is that it's not unknown to parties to come from third place into first place. Witness Charles Kennedy in 1983 and witness Angus MacDonald in the most recent election. It is possible, but I think the party, I think, is maybe one of the things we'll be discussing at this conference. It's just how do we chart a way forward from here, and I think we'll start in a very positive position, which is, wasn't the case in after 2017 or 2019.
Thank you. So, David, is there a sixth element and the impact of the First World War? Thank you.
I'm going to defend my book and argue that, that you don't need a sixth element, because the one that covers willingness of a larger party embraces David's point about is the Labour Party too tribal to deal with. I think it is quite a tribal party. It is one that doesn't really like dealing with other parties. But in fairness, all parties tend to large elements of tribalism. What we say about other parties tends to be quite tribal as well. And one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate until I sort of wrote this book is for such a long period of time, our party had actually been somewhat closer to the Tories than Labour. We'd still had these, electoral deals at a local level. So if you're a Labour leader in the 70s or 80s, you might not, or even 90s, you might not necessarily have thought this is a party that you can automatically do business with. So I think we ought to recognise the challenges without thinking that Labour will always be tribal about things. Could the Liberals still have, remained the second party had we not had the 1914, the Asquith Lloyd George thing? This is a real Lib Dem history group question rather than me, and I'd be overreaching myself. All I will say is, having written this book, whereas previously my view probably would have been that it was inescapable that Labour was eventually going to displace the Liberal Party, I think I've come more to the view that it wasn't completely inevitable. The self-inflicted wound of the Asquith Lloyd George split, did destroy the one team that was capable of potentially evolving things in the way they were before 1914. So I don't think it was inevitable, but it's one of the things I'm less confident about in the book, and I defer to colleagues in the Lib Dem history group. And the very last one, the blue wall thing, it's a really good question and very on the button for this moment. And all I would say is the experience after 97 is that when parties lose, there isn't an automatic bounce-back mechanism, particularly if they struggle to find a purpose, a unity, persuasive leadership. And, the results that we had in 2001 and 2005 built in some ways on 97. So it's not an easy process to go from 2024 and to continue going uphill. But the last experience of a massive Conservative defeat suggested that there's no automatic bounce-back mechanism there either, and therefore that aspiration is still the right one to have.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to both our